Welcome everyone. So I'm really excited once again to welcome Dr. Nwando Achebe to this conversation and to this really exciting book chat. As you know, because you're here, it's really part of the Abuja Literary Festival, which is themed around the art of empathy. And once again, my name is Amina Suleimani and I will be your host. I think first and foremost, I would like to introduce Dr. Nwando, if that's okay. If you don't know her already, she is the Jack and Margaret Sweet Endowed Professor of History and is a multi-award winning historian at Michigan State University. She's the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of West African History and the co-director of the Christie and Chinua Achebe Foundation. Achebe received her PhD from UCLA in 2000. Her research interests involve the use of oral history in the study of women, gender, and sexuality in Nigeria. Achebe is also the author of 6 books. Her first book, Farmers, Traders, Warriors, and Kings, Female Power and Authority in Northern Igbo Land, 1900s-1960s, was published in 2005. Achebe's second book, The Female King of Colonial Nigeria, Achebe Ubabe, apologies for the pronunciation.
Wonderful pronunciation.
I practiced it. Is the winner of 3 book awards, Ido Snyder, Barbara Penny Canner, and Gita Shodhori Book Awards, and is a full-length critical biography on the only female warrant chief and king in British Africa. Dr. Achebe is also the co-author of the 2018 History of West Africa e-course book. She's also co-editor with William Warger and Charles Ambler of A Comparison to African History, published in 2019, and co-editor with Cleo Robertson of Holding the World Together, African Women in Changing Perspective, also published in 2018. So Dr. Nwando, welcome again, and thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to be speaking with you about the book and about writing, and also about African female leadership in the past and in the present. And it would really perhaps be wonderful to hear from you how you're doing once again, and perhaps begin with a reading from a preface of your book, if that's okay. Wonderful. And to everyone joining us, well, welcome once again. We'll be doing a Q&A towards the end, so please feel free to send your questions throughout the conversation and we'll pick them up later.
Wonderful, thank you so very much. It is such an honor and privilege to have been, asked to do this with you, and I'm just extremely humbled and grateful, and I look forward to our conversation, as the morning or afternoon, progresses. So what I wanted to do, and welcome everyone, it's 10 a.m. here, so I will say good morning. Thank you for attending this session. What I want to do right now is just give you a little bit of a sense of my writing by reading my preface. And the preface to this new book is called Until Lions Have Their Own Historians, the Story of the Hunt Will Always Glorify the Hunter. Africanizing History and Feminizing Knowledge. Whose histories, whose stories, whose archives? Almost 6 decades ago, Africanist historian Terence Ranger pondered the question of to what degree African history was actually truly African, and whether the methods and concerns derived from Western historiography were in fact sufficient tools for researching and narrating African history. This issue remains a foremost concern of many African-born historians, such as myself, who continue to question the manner in which African worlds have been historically and contemporarily been reconstructed. We are cognizant of the fact that Africa was the site of some of the worst external abuses, a reality which resulted in a production of knowledge that has almost exclusively been shaped by these influences, We also share concerns regarding the ability of Africans to tell their own stories on their own terms, free from Eurocentric biases. We are especially concerned about this because the inconceivable and arbitrary violence born out of slavery and colonial discourse has produced an African canon that is as dehumanizing and silencing as brute force. From Muslim traders and travelers of the 7th to the 15th centuries documenting African worlds in their travel logs, to the accounts of European and Arab slavers, travelers, missionaries, and colonialists writing African worlds during the age of exploration, international slave trades, and conquest. These narratives have survived in what the 8th king of Dahomey, King Angelo, described in 1793 as, quote, books that never die, end quote, chronicling historical perspectives that were variously skewed, incomplete, and or ethnocentric in their leanings. It is these narratives that have propelled the very nature of Africanist scholarship in the present day. Again, I ask, whose stories, whose histories, whose archives? Given this historical reality, I have responded to the challenge of Africanizing and feminizing knowledge by attempting to restore voice and dignity to a people beset with memories of having been reduced to objects by slavers and colonial oppressors. I have done this by reframing and retelling the African gendered narrative in solidly African-centered and gendered terms. The end result is a body of scholarship, 6 monographs and a slew of journal articles and book chapters that is unapologetically African-centered. I have not rested easy with simply writing back at the received African canon. I have also, for the past 25 years, dedicated my career to honing my teaching of African history in the US college classroom. At Michigan State University, I have developed and taught several award-winning undergraduate level courses on Africa, courses in which I have disseminated African-centered knowledge about Africa to thousands of young and inquiring minds. In this context, I see myself as a missionary in reverse, one whose job it is to teach African worlds on their own terms. A person whose job it is to teach Africa in ways that Africans themselves conceptualize their histories and their worlds. And the end result of this pedagogical odyssey are histories that do not always neatly fit into Western-defined models of historical writing, understanding, and interpretation. Take, for instance, the fact that Africans do not necessarily conceptualize their histories exclusively in linear and strictly chronological terms. The proof of this can be found when a researcher approaches a living African archive, an African elder, with the following clear-sighted questions. What year did a particular event occur? Or how old are you? These questions may seem simple and straightforward and thus could be expected to elicit simple and straightforward answers. But no sooner does the elder respond that he or she does not know what year the incident happened, or worse still, shares with said researcher that he or she is about 150 years old. Then said researcher realizes that he or she has not asked the right questions. The right questions, the African-informed questions, should not be in what year did a particular event occur, or how old are you? They instead should be framed to discern what might have been happening historically around the time of the event or the elder's birth. Questions such as these would be sure to elicit more precise answers, answers such as the following. The event occurred when daytime became nighttime. Read, during the coming of the locusts. Or, I was born during the time of the great destroyer. Read, during the great influenza. Again, I ask, whose questions, whose archives, whose answers? For informed inquiry elicits informed answers and interpretations. I teach what I describe to my students as the history of another Africa, an Africa that they most likely will not find in the average run-of-the-mill test book. But it is the Africa that I know intimately, that I breathe, that I love. It is the Africa of my mother, grandmother, and all the African women who have, during my past 25 years of researching and writing African gendered worlds, entrusted me with their stories. It is an African history that continental Africans recognize and see themselves in. These are our histories, our stories, our archives.
I hope everyone is applauding as well. Thank you so much for this beautiful read of the preface. And to be honest, for me, reading the book was quite eye-opening, because you do situate it in a very African-centric perspective that recognizes, you know, the interconnectedness of so many worlds, and does provide this alternative way of researching seeing and being. It also made me think about the amount of, or the numerous women who've existed, who existed in my present and in my past, and what their role has been in shaping my understanding of where I come from, or the spaces in which I grew up. And I just want to take a few steps back to the acknowledgements page, which, you know, says a lot about the amount of labor that goes into any kind of creative work. And in yours, you really write about how intertwined with grief, because, you know, you lost your father in 2013 and your husband lost his sight, and yet the book remained a love project for you. And I was wondering if you could please tell us a little bit about the process of researching and writing as a journey, and how easy or how arduous it was to write back against, you know, this conventional classic Euro-American canon that you mentioned, while, you know, having one's feet and soul rooted in grief in some ways.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. This was an important book for me to write. It is a book that I agreed to write in early 2013. Signed the contract to do it. Actually, I agreed to write it in late 2012, because I remember it was during the African Studies Association meeting, and the director of Ohio University Press, you know, came to me to interest me in writing, you know, a book, whatever book that I might desire to write for Ohio University Press. And of course, I work on women and gender. I'm an oral historian, so this was definitely the book that I was going to write. So I agreed to write it in late 2012, I think it was like November. Signed the contract early 2013. My father passed away on the 21st of March, 2013. And so I had just signed the contract. What my father's passing did to me is that it paralyzed me in terms of my creative energies. I could not write. I was ridden with grief. I am the last of my parents' children. My name, Nwando, is a short form of the name Wabundo. Wabundo means a child is a shade. It is a name that's given to the last born of the family because I am the one who is supposed to live longest with my parents and shield and protect them, the shade, in their old age. And I like to think that that's what I did. My dad and I, Achebe, were extremely close. He was my best friend. He was the one that a day wouldn't pass without my hearing his voice, right? And so when this happened, when he passed away, I found that I lost my voice, my creative voice. And, I was thinking about it just in terms of 2 times that this has happened in my lifetime. The first time that this happened was when I was really, really young. I gave up speech, but I did it purposefully. I was maybe 2 or 3, and this was when our family came to the US. Right after the Biafran War, the Nigerian Biafran Civil War, my parents were in exile, and they needed to leave Nigeria to recover from, the atrocities that happened during the Nigerian Biafran War. And here I was being sent to a daycare. And I was I was one of 2 Black kids in the daycare. But the second Black kid did not look Black. He looked as though he was Caucasian. His mother was Black and his father was white. And these kids were so racist to us that I decided to give up speech. I gave up the English language because in my young mind, I didn't know how to deal with that. And what did I do? I would respond to them in my mother tongue, Igbo. So that was the first time I gave up speech. Fast forward to 2013, at the age of 43 years old, when my father passed, I couldn't write. And it took me the better part of 5-6 years to be able to put pen to paper. But of course, I type on my computer, so type. And, when I just felt like I had gotten to a point in my life where I could start to do that, and that the creative juices were beginning to flow, is about the time that my husband became blind. And that was another loss for me. That was sort of really, again, people, we talk about grief when people die, but there's another kind of grief when you mourn the life that you should have had or you feel that you should have had. And that was a process that I had to go through as well. And so, it took me that long to just sort of get out of that, climb out of that grief to start to write. But again, this was a book that was calling to me. I had another contract for another book that I had promised to do. And I called the publishers and I said, I can't do it. I just can't do it. But this book kept calling to me. And I think it kept calling to me because for the first time, here was a chance for me to write a book in an accessible language to a scholarly, if you would like, audience, right? All of my other books had been scholarly texts. And I had to jump at that opportunity to be able to tell our lives, our stories on our terms, right? And for me, there is really this what is it called? Connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead, right? When you sort of look at the African world and the way that we conceptualize our world, which is what I try to do in my writing, we believe in this never-ending cycle of life, that you are born, you get older, you die, and you're reborn, and the cycle continues. So in many ways, I saw my writing of this text as honoring my father, as honoring the ancestors, right? The people that had passed on, that had come before us, these strong, these powerful women that paved the way for you and I to become who we are. Without these women, from Hatshepsut in Egypt, without them, they are the ones who have given us the permission to be who we are. And so I felt that it was so of vital importance for me to pay tribute to them. So it was certainly, you know, it was a project that was so close to my heart, and yet a very difficult project to write because of grief, but also because, you know, here I am trying to represent the beauty, the 50, you're talking about 54 countries in Africa. I was not going to be writing about Africa south of the Sahara, which is what most people do. I was owning the continent from Egypt to Cape of Good Hope. And how do you do that in 240 pages? A lot has to be left out, right? And so it was a very arduous process for me to decide, who am I including and who am I not including? Because, you know, again, I wanted to make sure that we could recover, right, the voices of our ancestors or ancestresses, right? And so, yes, this was one of the most difficult books that I have written. Actually, it is the most difficult book that I've written thus far, but it was definitely a labor of love. Definitely.
And you can feel that. You can absolutely feel the love once you're reading it. And on the notion of spirituality, you very much, you know, use graphics to explain how the spiritual and the physical world are interconnected and interdependent to one another.
Yes.
And I think coming from multiple places across the continent, spirituality isn't something we can separate ourselves from. However, you know, to think of beliefs that value the presence of spirits and ghosts and goddesses is always associated with this idea of madness or primitiveness. And I think you write very much against that, and about female goddesses and also the construction of gender on the continent. Could you please tell us a little bit about perhaps the construction of the male god and what that means in regards to the exclusion of other female goddesses that exist?
Yes. Well, thank you for asking that question. If I were to look at my body of work and, you know, assess my contributions to knowledge, right? Sometimes we tell our students to do that. If I were to do that myself, I would say that my greatest contribution to the writing of African history is the insistence that we tell African history in African-centered ways. And once you do that, you realize that in the telling of African history, to focus exclusively on the human, visible world is to only tell half of African history. You know, we are a people that have suffered from encroachments, whether you heard me read my preface, right, where I was talking about these Arab traders coming in, slavers, colonialists, right? So we have been this continent that has been encroached upon by others. And these others have taught us that that which is African is no good. They have brought with them their religion, whether it be Islam or Christianity. People tend to think, oh, we've always had these religions. No, we haven't. We had our own way of being, our own way of conceptualizing the world. And all of a sudden, we have been taught that those things are no good. What I am doing, my job, is to extricate ourselves from that nonsense, to be able to look at African worlds and say, this is the way we were, and this is the way we are. And so if you look at African world, the African world, Africans in general believe in these two interconnected worlds, the human visible and the spiritual non-visible. So we believe that there's spirits all around us, starting from the great God. And I like to say, hey, if you're a Christian or you're a Muslim or you're whatever religion you are, if you believe in God, it is the same God that Africans believe in. But we call our God different names. There are over 3,000 different nations of people in Africa that speak different languages and have different cultures. Each one of those groups has a name for God, right? The way in which we worship God is different from perhaps the way that a Muslim worships God or a Christian worships God, right? We believe that there are these lesser gods and goddesses who are personifications of natural phenomena, right? And we believe in oracles and ancestors, etc. And so what I have done is to privilege the ways in which we see our world, and to argue that if you are writing about African gendered history, you cannot just focus on human women, you have to focus on what I term the female spiritual principle, which starts with God. And, you know, let's start with God. In the English language, in these European languages, we were colonized by Europeans, right? Whether it be the British in Nigeria, you have the Portuguese, you have the Germans, right? Lusophone Africa, Anglophone Africa, the French Francophone Africa. All of those European languages are gender specific. So they are the languages that came into Africa and taught us about he and she. African languages are not gender specific. And so the ways in which Africans imagined great God was not a he. In my book, I talk about how great God became a he, because we are forced to write about God in European languages. In African languages, for the most part, God is a he, she. God is a force. So even, I mean, you're even talking about people like my dad, right, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, those first generation of Africans that really sort of, you know, brought African literature to the world, right? When my dad wrote about Chukwu, the Igbo god, he necessarily had to write about Chukwu as he, because the English language did not have a word to describe he, she. And so this is what I'm trying to do in my book, is to say, look at the balance of male and female principles, right? That's what African societies are calling for, this very balance of male and female principles. So you have a God that's neither male or female. You have these gods and goddesses. Let's take a god and goddesses. You have a goddess. For the most part, when you have a goddess, you have a male priest. When you have a god, for the most part, you have a priestess. It is that balance of male and female principles that African society is so looking for. And so that's what I try to do in my book. And my argument is essentially that the real rulers of African towns, communities, kingdoms are the spirits, and that human beings are merely there to interpret the world of the spirits. And so when you look at politics, I talk about the spiritual political constituency, which when you look at it, you have the great God, you have the goddesses, gods, you have oracles, you have female medicines, you have priestesses, you have rain queens, you name it, you have them, sangomas, right? That's the spiritual political constituency. The human is of human beings like you and I, right? But those are two political constituencies that happen simultaneously in African societies. Okay, and that's what I try to do in this book. Yeah. So I am historicizing not just human beings, but I go from God and I deal with deities, oracles, priestesses, female medicines, anything that is female in the African worldview, I historicize, and I talk about the power that is within those female entities. That's what I'm doing in this book. And in that way, telling the entire history.
Absolutely. I see a lot of comments of people who are asking where can they get the book.
So the book, this is the first time, hallelujah, and this is why this is a book I wanted to write. This is the first time that I have a book that is, in terms of accessibility and actually also the price of the book. As most of you know, history books tend to be extremely expensive. For the first time, this is the cheapest book I've written. It's actually $14.95 or $9.99 on Amazon. So you can get an online version either on Kindle or Nook. And sometimes, actually, I think Amazon even has a sale right now where you can get it for like less than $9.99. And so it is relatively, accessible and available for people, who would like to read it. I also know that I believe it's available in South Africa. I need to talk with my publishers. One of the things that I wanted to make sure was that this book would be available on the African continent. I do note that they have a relationship with distributors in South Africa. And one of the things that I will be working very hard on doing is to make sure that at least in my country of birth and in other countries in Africa, that this book will be available. But for now, if people are able, it's available on Amazon. And it's available on a number of online, Barnes and Noble, and some other online companies.
Thank you so much. And just to reiterate to everyone, there was a comment by the admins. You can reach out to Robin Heights if you're in Nigeria, and they will procure copies for you. So just going back to, that's amazing.
Music to my ears. None of my other books are in Nigeria, so this is music to my ears.
I'm very curious, when you speak about female entities and all these women and female goddesses you've written about, I was wondering if there was a specific one that you truly enjoyed writing about more than the other ones. Not that they could be equated.
Not that I could choose, because I own all of Africa. That's the beauty, I think, about what it is that we do. If you were to ask me who my audience is, my audience has always been African people, right? I write for Africans, and I write for any African diaspora people. And I write for those groups of people so that they can see themselves in their history and be proud of who they are, right? That is like my bottom. So when you ask that question of who, I just feel like you're asking me to choose from, like, almost like a parent being asked which one of your kids is your favorite. Luckily, I only have one kid, so I tell her she's my favorite all the time. But no, I really enjoyed writing all of these lives for different reasons, right? If I were to choose one person in the human realm, I believe I would choose King Achebe. And the reason that I would choose her is that she's very close to my heart. Before I discovered Achebe on page 158 of C.K. Meek's book, was just one, and he didn't even write her name. He just said that something curious is happening in this town where a woman is called Eze, and he used that term. Eze is king. And I thought to myself, yoo-hoo, I'm gonna find out who this woman is, and especially in an egalitarian system that has no kings. So Achebe is somebody that I discovered, and because I discovered her, her story goes counter to canon, the received canon about Igbo women, right? So obviously, my writing about her is special. But if I were to sort of leave her and move into the spiritual, I would really say that one of the favorite women to write about or entities, divine entities, are the Lovadu rain queens. So they are spiritual government, right? These are rain queens that are embodiments of spiritual beings. So they are not your regular human beings. They are born human, but are endowed with spiritual idiosyncrasies. And the reason why I love them, apart from the fact that they are so incredibly powerful, right? The reason I love them is that they actually go against my demarcation of what political life looks like in Africa. So in my books, I've argued that there are essentially two political constituencies, right? The spiritual and the human. Within the spiritual and human, each political constituency is divided into two as well. So I've argued on the human side that you have, if it's a centralized society, you're going to have male kings, but you're also going to have female queens. And so male and female, that balance of male and female principles, right, in the human realm. In the spiritual realm, it's the same. However, the Lovadu go against my argument, and I guess that's why I love them, right? In Lovadu, in the kingdom of Lovadu, they didn't have male reign queens and female reign queens. They only had female reign queens. So the Lovadu people have an exclusively female government, but they weren't always like that. Really earlier on in their life, they had male kings, and these male kings did not rule correctly. They didn't do very good things. And because they weren't doing very good things, they were unable to make that connection with the spiritual world in order to produce rain. And so at some point in their history, around the 1800s, women took over. And they were close to the divine and were able to interact with the divine to produce rain. And they have remained so until today. So it is there might be others that I'm not familiar with, but it's certainly one of the only, or one of the few political constituencies in Africa that is not male and female, but is only female. And so it was quite thrilling to write about that particular group. Yes.
Thank you so much. And to me, the book was very much presenting a decolonial archive, as you said, the alternative of knowledges that have been subjugated from the public discourse, because I probably never heard about any of the female leaders or monarchs that you've mentioned in the book, in except to the present, to the current female leaders, which you mentioned at the end, and which you also do quite a wonderful job at, calling out the corrupt ones and really highlighting that it's not all jolly by virtue of them being women in leadership positions. But just to speak about these dominant discourses and dominant narratives, I was really wondering about the African imaginary, and how come a lot of these female monarchs and female queens do not exist in the mainstream, or their stories are not highlighted enough. Do you think that there are particular histories that have been silenced, or processes of silencing that have happened which made it so?
For sure. And one of the reasons why I wanted to read my preface was it really sort of speaks to this question that you've just asked, right? Whose histories, whose archives are we telling? A lot of people tend to, I'm a historian by training, right? So a lot of people tend to think of the archive as this unproblematic space. You just go to the archive, and if it's in the archive, you can get this evidence, and then we can write our histories. Now, if I had decided to look to the archive to write my histories, none of my 6 books would have been written. None of them. And the reason I say this is that the archive, as we speak about it in Africa, is a very Eurocentric space. A lot of people don't really sort of look at the history of archive making. We didn't have archives, the European type of archives, because that I talk about the African archive, which is the living African individual. Each of us are archives, right? And I'll get back to that in a moment. But the European archive in Africa came out of the colonial and the colonizing enterprise, where these colonial governments sent these government-appointed anthropologists to write about the people in whom they were colonizing. So it was to help the colonizing enterprise. And I like to say, the colonizers are not going to write glowing stories about the colonized because they wanted to make the colonized look as though they were inept, look as though they were children to justify colonization. You're not going to write glowing stories about the people that you're colonizing. You're just not, right? And so the archive, the European archive in Africa is already problematic. Then when you sort of add to the equation that you had these old European men going into Africa, who are they interviewing? Who is more apt to talk to them? It's not African women. So they were interviewing old African men. So you got a very male-centered or male-centric evidence in the archive. So those of us that want to do and uncover women's voices necessarily have to come up with a different methodology, which is, yes, I go to the archive and I've looked through the archive, but if you rely only on the archive, women's voices are not there. And so that's why I say, first and foremost, I'm an oral historian. I go into the communities and I talk to people. I talk to both men and women about, about women. But I use other methods. I use jewelry, I use cloth, I use proverbs, I use songs, I use geomapping. Wherever there is history, I look for that history. And it's not necessarily in these conservative, archives. You have to go in search of the history of women. If you were to open up your regular textbooks, there are very few textbooks that talk about these women. You were saying a lot of these women you just heard about for the first time in my book. Why is that? You're talking about mining footnotes. You're talking about mining, maybe in a textbook, it's like one sentence or one little reference to someone. So it is this having to piece together. It's a painstaking effort in piecing together women's lives from so many different archives. And it does take a while. In my King Achebe book, I write about it as, I see myself as a carpenter who takes a piece of wood and you're not sure where you're going with it, but you keep tending it and adding things. And all of a sudden, you've come up with this thing. You've created something, right? That's the process of history writing. That's the process of those of us who work on women's history, who work on gender history, like it's not even a choice. That's what we have to do. I look to history wherever I can find it. And 9 out of 10 times, it's not in your average archive because those voices are just not there.
Absolutely, and I think we really noticed this in your in the chapter on West African merchant queens, which you've taken of yourself. And there was this picture that really stood out to me that you took in Enugu State in Nigeria. And some of these pictures were taken in the 90s, which was probably when you were doing field work and research. Yeah. And I'm really interested to hear, or for you to share with us about this correspondence that you have with these physical women that you speak with.
Yes.
The question.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I don't call the people that entrust me with their stories. I hate the term informant. That's a term you'll find in a lot of anthropological texts, and I reject it. Because in my mind, I think that without those people that entrust their lives and their stories to us, I'm the vehicle in which their lives and stories are being expressed in written form. I am nothing absolutely nothing without, I call them my oral history collaborators. And I use that term, oral history collaborator, because I see our work as a collaboration. Without them entrusting their lives in me and trusting me to write about them in the ways in which they the ways in which they conceptualize their lives, then I won't be doing what I'm doing, right? And so for me, the field work environment is a very important one. And it is one that must be cultivated, right? You don't just sort of go and take and leave. For me, I write about my fieldwork experience in all of my books because it's so important. It starts with an introduction to the community that you're writing in. I can't just sort of enter any community and start asking questions. That is a no can do. You can't do that. You know, you must follow the culture of the people, which mandates that if I were to enter into a community, the communities that I work in are these egalitarian communities that have no kings or queens. I work among the Igbo. That's like the first group of people that I worked, you know, among in the 90s when I took those pictures. And so what did I have to do? I would go into the community and introduce myself to the elders, to the male and female elders. And in Igbo land, you had, in the area of Igbo land that I worked in, they were called the Onyishi, the oldest person in the community, both male and female. I would take kola nut, which is a symbol of peace, that I have come to your community in peace, and I would ask for permission to be allowed into the community, telling them what it is that I was doing. Now, beyond that, you talked to me about, you're asking about relationships. I formed long-term relationships with my oral history collaborators. Everything that I wrote in my first and second book, guess what I did? I fed it back to the community. And I had the community talk back. I presented my work to the community that gave me and entrusted their lives in me so that they could talk back to me and criticize what it is that I had written. And that is the way that I constantly, what I call negotiating meaning. I negotiated meaning with members of the community by presenting the work that I had done to them and allowing them to say, heck no, this interpretation ain't it. When I said so-and-so to you, that's not what I meant, right? And so it's this back and forth that produces this history that I write. And that's why in some of my other writing, I've actually referenced myself. I call myself a people's historian. I'm a people's historian because of this back and forth, and because it is so important for me to represent people the ways in which they represent themselves. So I'm not just this person that just writes whatever. I know that I have relationships with the community that I write about. And I know that I'm going to go back to that community, and therefore I must write about them in ways in which they see themselves in their lives and all of that. And so, yes, it's very important. Those pictures, permission, I have their permission not only to take the pictures, but to also use the pictures in my publications. So this is not a matter of you just sort of go and you take pictures and you publish them without permission. It's this constant, not only negotiating meaning, but also these long-term relationships that I had with members of the community in which I researched. Yeah.
Dr. Nwando,
people are now passed away, unfortunately. Yeah, but that's one way to sort of pay tribute to them. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of us on this call and people watching, I don't think we can get enough of hearing you speak about your positionality, about how you do research and your writing. And we only have 10 minutes left, and there are a few questions which have come through. But yeah, I think an hour is quite unfair for this conversation. So one of the questions says, today most African societies are highly fictionalized along ethnic and religious lines. historically, is there any evidence of greater commonality in our past?
That's a good question. How do I answer it? When you think about the African world before colonialism, again, remember that all of the demarcations that we have in Africa right now, country demarcations, were not there pre-colonially, right? Before the Europeans came. Before the Europeans came, there's a wonderful map I like to show my students. It's a map of the way that Africa looked before the Europeans came. And it's really essentially Africa with they look like really tiny nations, over 3,000 of these nations. That's the Africa that we had before the pre-colonial era. And again, when you think about that Africa, you're talking about over 3,000 nations of people that spoke different languages and had different cultures. And that's important to know, because those cultures did not necessarily get along. It's just, this is the historical truth. These cultures didn't necessarily get along. Some of them did, others didn't. You had cultures that fought against one another. Centralized kingdoms, the nature of centralized kingdoms was to expand. So a lot of those centralized kingdoms would often fight wars with their neighbors, sometimes their enemies, and continue to expand and in essence, bring them into their kingdoms as vassal states. So there wasn't, it's a misnomer really to sort of look at pre-colonial Africa and think that, all of these nations got along. No, they didn't. Some did, but not all, right? And that's why when you think about whether it be the international slave trades, where, I always tell my students when they say, Africans sold one another, to the Europeans, that is crock. Again, you have to sort of understand what the African world looked like pre-colonially. No African is selling his or her brother. They're selling their enemy, prisoners of war, right? People that they fought against, right? So your skin tone, there was no such thing as, this person is Black and this person is no. So this whole idea of race is something that we imagined, a lot later. Pre-colonially, your identity actually was your nation. It was your language. And so this one group, maybe the Xhosa, mightn't have gotten along with the Zulus, right? So as far as the Xhosa and the Zulus were concerned, they were not brothers if they didn't get along, right? But certain groups did get along. And that's really the reality, of pre-colonial Africa, is that you have these nations, over 3,000 nations of people that lived in this continent. But colonialism just sort of drew these lines and put us all together and said, okay, you're now Nigeria, you're now one Nigeria, you're now one Tanzania, you're now one South Africa, without any, what is it called? Without really sort of looking at the people that they were carving out. And so a lot of our problems now have to do with these colonial boundaries, where they're putting people that didn't necessarily get along together and saying, all of a sudden you're one people.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other things that happens is that we start seeing each other as different communities throughout the continent through these colonial lenses. And so
Yes.
it's really impossible for us to really get to understand. I think a lot of people are really excited to get to see the map. I don't know if it has a name in particular that we could share.
I don't, because I wish I knew, and I would have pulled it. Maybe I can share it with maybe the organizers later on. I'll pull it out and share it with the organizers later on, so that I don't know if they have a way to get it to people, because it's not something at my fingertips that I would have to go into my teaching notes to pull it out.
No, totally. Yeah. I think that would be possible. Thank you so much. So I just want to go back to the quote that you begin and end the book with, which is these are our histories, our stories, and our archives. And I just want to ask you, we have 5 minutes left. What does it mean to be writing history today? and how can we, as individuals who may not necessarily be historians, interrupt this history and transform it, and start bringing these subjugated knowledges to the public discourse again.
For me, it's about, and I think I go back to my training as an oral historian, right? It's about truly listening. We need to listen, and we need to truly hear the voices. And when I say voices, I'm not just talking about human beings, the whispers, right? I historicize the history of these spiritual entities, right? It's about hearing. It's about being willing to truly hear and understand, and to ask questions when you don't quite understand, right? So for me, it's about learning from the people, the owners of this knowledge, the owners of the archive. For me, I'm able to represent the spiritual world the way that I do because during my PhD research, what did I do? I visited over 300 shrines, and I sat with the priests of these, because they were all shrines of goddesses, because I was interested in documenting the world of goddesses. And I sat with these priests and I just said to them, please teach me about this goddess. I want to learn. So it's really as simple as bringing ourselves to that, down to that level. Knowing that, telling ourselves that we don't necessarily know everything. And being willing to truly listen, hear, and represent people the way in which they really sort of demand to be represented. So for me, it's, that's really the, the base at its most basic level, is that that's what we need to do.
I totally agree. I think listening and hearing is so overlooked because it's always thought that it's very simple. But there is a process of unlearning that goes into it, because you have to deconstruct so much of what you learned.
You really do. You really do. And our university systems, especially at home, are very colonized. We are still, dealing with the textbooks, the materials that we're reading are very colonized, and that's one, place that we sort of have to sort of work hard in trying to decolonize our universities and our learning processes. So this doesn't naturally, the fact that somebody's born in Africa and has grown up in Africa does not mean that they're looking at African worlds in African-centered ways. In fact, I would, hazard a guess to say that a lot of people, just because of the kind of educational system that we have in Africa, are perhaps not looking at Africa in African-centered ways. They're very looking at it in very Eurocentric and really not realizing that that's what we are doing.
Absolutely. Totally. I think all I can do is agree so much with everything you've said. And again, 1 hour is really not fair for this conversation. And everyone here just wants to keep listening to you. And I think your book, perhaps for anyone who's wondering, where to start in regards to this notion of deconstructing and trying to unlearn, your book is probably a point of departure for a lot of us. So please make sure that you find your way towards the book. I was able to get mine on Kobo, which is something like Amazon, and it was also very affordable. So it's been quite an amazing journey, and thank you so much, Dr. Nwando, for everything you've provided us with today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think this conversation is recorded for anyone who would like to go back to it, to rewatch or re-listen or write notes, because this is an archive in itself. And I hope we'll be able to read more from your work in the upcoming years as well.
Hope so too. Thank you so very much. And thank you for the people that attended. I truly appreciate your being here. Thanks.
Thank you. There's so many thank words going in. I hope.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Tanya.
Hi.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Hi, Teddy. How are you?
This was incredible.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Incredible. It's wonderful. And what you said just at the last point, about how being African doesn't mean that you don't think in a Eurocentric way. I think it's really important. And
Yeah.
you have to do the hard work of unlearning these things.
No, we do. We
Yes,
really do.
with Western media, that's what we saw. A lot of us that even write, ask anyone, they'll say their first story was with a white character in the middle.
Yeah.
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 So
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that really gets me is how our people, we still call ourselves tribe. I just, anytime I hear it, I flinch. Because if you look at the interpretation, what is tribe? A primitive people. How do we call ourselves a primitive people? And we just, very proudly, oh, I'm from this tribe. No, we're nations of people. I would like to see us change terminology and really start talking about ourselves the way that we should. We are this nation, or that ethnic group, or just call yourself what you are. I am Yoruba, I am Igbo, I am Zulu, I am Xhosa. So I mean, it's very entrenched. It truly is, because we've been taught this from when we were little. When I was little, I was talking about, oh, I'm from this tribe and that. And I'm like, wait a minute, really? No. And so, in my classes here, my students know me because I have what I call stop words. And those words are words they're not allowed to use when you talk about Africa. Tribe is number one. You must look for a different way of, referring to Africans and referring to ourselves. We've got to.
yeah. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
This as well, so it will be recorded on.
Okay, wonderful. Will you send me a link at some point?
Yes,
Thank you.
so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Amina. Amina is Moroccan. I don't know if you mentioned.
I know, she's just wonderful. Thank you.
It's been an honor.
Thank you.